For our lecture today, Alan begins the story of Norris Bradbury, and I'm wearing my khakis, as are, I know, some other people I know, in honor of Norris today. So, before we learn about Norris, let's learn a little bit about Alan. Alan Carr joined Los Alamos National Laboratory 10 years ago and currently serves as laboratory historian. During his time here, he has produced numerous publications. He has lectured here and nationally and has appeared and been heard on many local, national, and international radio and television programs. Before coming here, he completed his graduate work at Texas Tech University, and if you've ever spoken to Alan more than once, you know that he remains an ardent supporter. I've personally enjoyed working with Alan on many projects, including our 70th anniversary lecture series and the Informal History Committee. Please welcome Alan Carr.
I would like to talk just a little bit about the history of the presentation itself. I am very grateful to the Los Alamos Historical Society because this was commissioned for the 60th anniversary a few years ago, and I haven't given this talk publicly since then. I have given it a couple times to laboratory audiences and to other groups elsewhere that have asked for it, but it's grown into 2 presentations, as many of my other presentations have over the years. So I appreciate the Historical Society. If you're not a member, let me strongly encourage you to join the Historical Society. There's going to be a talk at Fuller Lodge tonight by Don Farrell, which is hosted by the Society. He's the historian for Tinian Island, the island of Tinian, from which the nuclear strikes in World War II were launched. And so that's going to be a fantastic talk tonight. He's come a long way. I just came a few blocks to give this talk. Don came a long way, so make sure if you're able to, go to Fuller Lodge tonight at 7:30. So I want to start out by sharing an anecdote with you about that I think will set up the presentation fairly nicely. We get lots of people from all over the world who come here to Los Alamos, who come here to visit the Bradbury Science Museum. Internationally known laboratory, and this facility that we're in right now, the museum of the laboratory as well. Often when we get visitors, they'll want to talk to the laboratory historian or the museum director or somebody who knows about the laboratory. And one of the questions that I almost always get is, why is it the Bradbury Science Museum? Who's Bradbury? They want to know why this isn't the Oppenheimer Science Museum. And that's a valid question. Oppenheimer is probably the most famous employee. He's the most famous employee that this institution has ever had. He was our first director. But I think that we got it right when this was named after Norris Bradbury, because the wartime laboratory just does not exist anymore. It was a very short-term, temporary thing. And it is what we see today, the large, multidisciplinary, permanent institution that Los Alamos has become, is Norris Bradbury's invention. And so I'm going to show you how that happened in the next 2 presentations. So who is Norris Bradbury anyway? And I put together this list of some of his academic credentials. You can look at these. He was a summa cum laude graduate of Pomona College. Pomona is kind of east of Los Angeles in the Fontana area, if you've been out there before. He's a National Research Council Fellow. He was a Naval Reserve officer. Berkeley-trained physicist, a Stanford professor. He was a wartime group leader. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And here's some interesting things that he's been called. He's been referred to as the savior of Los Alamos, the architect of the modern laboratory, and simply Mr. Los Alamos. Well, why? That's what we're going to get into. I want to tell you, so that's his background, those are his qualifications, but what other things did he do? What did he do on the side when he was not saving Los Alamos and designing the laboratory? Well, he was a skilled woodworker, he was a gardener, and I do want to point out that you can see those pictures there on your left-hand side of the screen. Look at the grass. That must have been before the gophers arrived, right? Bradbury, I keep a yard too, and that's why Norris Bradbury is my hero. It has nothing to do with the lab or any of that business or our community. It's that lawn. That is amazing. Uh, he was a mechanic, and he had to be. You're going to find out why when I tell you about the car that he drove for many years. He was an avid reader. He was a world traveler. You can see him riding on the elephant there. That's not at the Albuquerque Zoo. That is during one of his trips to India. And he was a family man. What was he really like? So we know his academic credentials. We know the stuff he enjoyed doing on the side. But what kind of man was he? If you met Norris Bradbury, what would he be like? I collected some quotes that were taken from different people that I hope will start to express the type of person he was. I like this first one the best. Well, I like the last one too, as you'll see. But he lived as though he were killing snakes every minute of the day. And if there were snakes to be killed, I'd probably be pretty energetic, and as was Norris. Whatever he was doing, it was always zip, zip, zip. He was a nice man, both fair and honest. He was careful and conservative. He was very calm and collected when he was not killing snakes. He was not flamboyant, and that is an understatement. Again, as you'll see as we go on. This next one is going to be critical to the lecture throughout, because you're going to see why it was so important time after time. He was easy to like. Have you ever been around, hopefully you've been around a lot of people like that, who are just easy to like. You meet them and immediately they're your best friend, right? That was the type of person Norris Bradbury was. He was very likable. And then my favorite quote on the page down here, he was patient, even with Edward Teller, who you see pictured there with him. We'll see. I wouldn't be surprised if Ted pops back up before the lectures are over, either today or next week. Now, when Norris Bradbury passed away, his National Academy of Sciences biography was penned by Harold Agnew and Raymer Schreiber. Many of you may have known either or both of those men. I'm disappointed to report that Harold's not in very good health right now. He's approaching 93, and he's not doing that great. Harold's had a really good run, but these days he's not doing that well, unfortunately. Harold and Raymer wrote in the biography of Bradbury, he had little patience for the perks of top management. His office was strictly functional, no carpeting, no lounge chairs, simply GI office furniture. There were no reserved parking areas for individuals. His usual attire was casual. In fact, if he appeared for work in a business suit, it meant he was expecting VIPs or that he was about to leave on official business. His office door was open all day, except when he was in conference. He answered his phone himself, unless he was already on the line. For a number of years, he drove a battered Model A Ford coupe with a rumble seat and warned passengers to beware of the insecure door locks and the holes in the floorboards. He eventually donated the car to the high school student shop for use in repair practice. So I guess this was the day before the BMWs took over there. That was Norris's car for a long time, but I think that was part of the appeal of Norris Bradbury, part of his likability. He was just so down to earth. He was very humble, he was likable, and again, that's going to play an enormous part in his success as the director of the laboratory for all those years. Come on in, we got lots of seats. Bring friends with you. So now, hopefully you're getting a sense of who Norris Bradbury was. I want to go back and tell you a little bit more about his early personal life. So Norris Edwin Bradbury was born May 30th, 1909 in Santa Barbara, California. His mother, Elvira, who you can see there, was a school teacher, and you can see little baby Norris there with that grin on his face. It never went away. You're going to see that grin decade after decade throughout the presentation. His father, Edwin, was an electrician, a gardener, a landscape architect, a vine dresser, a rancher, a machinist, and a stamp collector. So just as Norris, his son, was multi-talented, so was his father as well. Bradbury had a sister, and unfortunately she died as an infant, so his parents adopted twins. He had a couple of twin siblings. He attended Hollywood High School, which I thought that sounds more like a movie, but I guess there is an actual Hollywood high school, and Chaffee Union High Schools when he was growing up. He was 16 years old when he graduated. 16. So I think a lot of times, Bradbury was the director for so long, as we're going to see, for 25 years. I think a lot of times people think of him as more of a outstanding scientific administrator, if you'll forgive the term. Norris Bradbury was incredibly bright. He was very sharp. At 16 years old, I was not even close to graduating high school. Lucky that I graduated at all. Linda didn't read my alternate biography. Maybe we'll use that one next month if anybody shows up. So, and again, come back next month, hear the rest of the talk, bring your friends with you. So Bradbury, the college student, he was a member of Pi Kappa Alpha. And I do apologize. I do a little bit of reading up front as we go through this background material. I'll tell more sea stories for those of you who like that kind of thing as we go on. In 1929, Bradbury received his BA in chemistry from Pomona College. He stuck close to home. And he completed his dissertation on the mobility of ions in gases. In 1932, he received his PhD in physics from Berkeley, and he studied under Professor Leonard B. Lubb. You can see a photograph of Professor Lubb right there. He's going to come back into play. You're going to see him at the end of next month's presentation. He was able to come out here to visit Los Alamos, but he's going to be an important character in Bradbury's life and an important character as the story begins to take shape. Bradbury, one thing I will point out, if you've been in Los Alamos for a while and you know a lot of folks who've been around throughout the years, so the picture of the fraternity there, that's Bradbury right up there. I need do we have a laser pointer today? So here we go. So that's Norris Bradbury right there. This guy right here is Duncan McDougall. Anybody heard of Duncan McDougall before? So they were in the fraternity together. Helps to have friends, right? So Duncan was a senior leader at the laboratory for many years as well. He and Norris went way back. So Norris won Whitting and National Research Council fellowships, and in 1933 and 1934 he studied at MIT. Now, one thing that I would like to point out before we go on is what's going on during these years. 1930, 32, 33, 34. This is the Great Depression. I mean, this is really a bad part of the Great Depression. Things have just gotten underway. People don't know just what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty in the country. There aren't a lot of jobs to go around. Bradbury, I point that out to say Bradbury was an incredibly competitive candidate for these jobs. It's not like MIT and these other places were just saying, hey, we've got lots of vacancies, lots of openings, lots of money to give out. You had to be the very best of the very best to get these few jobs that were available back then. So he made some big decisions in the years that followed, in the early into the mid-1930s. Now, in 1933, Norris married Lois Platt. And as you can see on the next bullet there, they had been married 64 years when Norris passed away. From this point forward, you're going to see some quotes in italics. If it's in italics and it's on the presentation, Norris Bradbury said it. And I like this first one that I'm going to share from you. Norris relates, Lois was the sister of my roommate in college. She was engaged to someone else. The engagement fell apart, and I moved in. So Norris, the romantic, right? They had 3 sons together, James, who goes by Jim, John, and David. Now, going back to Professor Lubb, he was a former Naval Reserve officer, and he said, well, gee, Norris, you might consider joining the Navy as well. Might be good to add to your academic qualifications, get to know some people there. I think a lot of times when we think of the military, we just think of combat soldiers and that type of thing. The military has people from all walks of life who are in uniform. We have many soldier scientists here at the laboratory today. And that's what Norris Bradbury was at this time. He became a soldier scientist. He became an ordnance specialist in the early 1930s, and interestingly enough, as you can see there, Lieutenant Commander Chester Nimitz signed Bradbury's commission. He got a promotion or two, Nimitz did, after these years. If you've been to Central Texas, to the San Antonio area, maybe you're familiar with Fredericksburg. Chester Nimitz is from Fredericksburg, Texas. He went on to command essentially the Pacific War in World War II. He was in charge of the Pacific Theater. And there's a nice museum. The Nimitz Museum is there in Fredericksburg. I encourage you to visit if you're in the San Antonio area and have a couple of hours to drive out there. So we can see Norris and Lois there. They make a lovely couple, don't they? And so now his life is really starting to solidify at this point. In 1935, he was named assistant professor of physics at Stanford. So he's gone to school at Berkeley. He's worked at MIT. Now he's employed by Stanford. Not bad. Not bad at all. Huh? By then, he had published numerous articles in prestigious publications. He was an expert, as you can see, on the conduction of electricity and gases, ion properties. Again, that goes back to his dissertation work, and atmospheric electricity. Now things are going to start to heat up, though, in the war and in Norris's life as well. In early 1941, Bradbury was called to active duty. Why? Yeah, the war in Europe has been going on since 1939. The United States is not actively involved, I guess. I guess that's a decent word to use, but we're not at war yet. But what happened at the end of 1941? Pearl Harbor. So at this point, he's called up to active duty. Things are looking bad. The clouds are starting to gather, the clouds of war, and things are not looking good. Now, what did he do while he was there in the Navy? He actually had a very, very important job. He studied the exterior ballistics of naval projectiles. What does that mean? You know, that has everything to do with the accuracy of your ordnance. So if you have an artillery shell, if you have, in this case, a shell for a naval gun, it can be pretty explosive and devastating, but if it doesn't hit its target, it's not going to do you a lot of good. Accuracy is everything, and that's what he worked on during the war. You can see his quote there: "The first round from a gun might be its last. It was necessary to hit the target the first time." If you don't hit the target the first time, the odds of that first round being its last goes up substantially. So he had a very important job, and you can see Norris with Lois on your left over there, and with his first couple of children, Jim and John, I believe, are the ones in the photos there, and he's in uniform. So now we're going to start to meet some other characters. We're going to start to get closer to Los Alamos. He was assigned to the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia, to do this work, and he met some other very important people that would factor not only important to his life, but to the work here at Los Alamos and far beyond as well. At Dahlgren, he worked with Professor Lubb. We all remember the professor, right? And also Captain William Parsons. Anybody heard that name before? So several of you are nodding your head, yes. Now, Parsons will be the subject of next month's 70th anniversary lecture. My predecessor and friend Roger Mead will be discussing Deke Parsons' career. And what is the second Tuesday of the, actually it's August 14th.
Second Wednesday.
Second Wednesday, I apologize. Thank you, Linda. August 14th, which is another important date. Anybody know what happened on August 14th, 1945? You didn't know there was going to be trivia, did you? The end of the war, the armistice with the Japanese, right? So easy date to remember. Be here at 5:30 on Armistice Day. Well, I can't call it that, but the end of the war. So in 1943, Parsons left mysteriously. Nobody knew where he went. Now, we know, you see it on the slide up there, if nothing else, but Parsons disappeared out here to New Mexico. He spent about a year out here working. Again, Lubb, Bradbury, everybody else in the world, they didn't know where Parsons went. So Parsons offered Bradbury a job to join him on the work that he was doing. And, you know, like so many other people, Bradbury wasn't excited about coming to Los Alamos. Very few people were. And one of the reasons why is that they were already doing important work elsewhere. That was the case with many of the scientists, including Norris Bradbury. You know, he's working on the accuracy of shells for naval ships. That's pretty important to the war effort. Why should he leave? He wasn't really excited about it, but he accepted the offer after some initial hesitation. You can see the quote there. And unfortunately, for some reason, my picture of Parsons disappeared. There should be a picture of Deke there, but I think we'll have another one. Bradbury says, "My conscience got the better of me. I got to thinking about the blue uniform I was wearing, and who was I to argue about where I was assigned? I called Parsons and told him I'd take the job." So that's how Norris Bradbury got here. He never left. So very, very important decision for him. What happened once he got here? Well, first of all, the Bradbury family, and again, there's he's got a couple of children at this point in time. They lived in a Sunt apartment and later a bathtub row home. Now the Sunts are all gone now, but many of the Sunts, and I think the Sunt that the Bradbury family lived in is not far from where the movie theater is today. That's where a lot of those older apartments were, and you can see a picture of some of them right there. Pretty humble place to call home. However, he got to live in a bathtub row house for a while. And so for those of you who are not familiar, Bathtub Row is a street here in Los Alamos. Fuller Lodge sits on Bathtub Row. And that's where all of the houses that predated World War II were. All the people who worked for the ranch school that was here before the war, they had those houses. And it's called Bathtub Row because during the war, there were thousands of people who lived in town. But the only bathtubs, the only place you could take a bath in town during World War II was in one of those luxurious rustic homes over on Bathtub Row. So that was high living to be able to live there. Robert Oppenheimer had a house there. Sir James Chadwick, who was only here for a very short time, the leader of the British mission, Nobel laureate, discoverer of the neutron, he had a Bathtub Row house. So you had to be a very high stature to be assigned one of those houses. Now, while Bradbury was here, he was a leader at the laboratory. He was a group leader for several organizations. He was the head of E5, which was implosion experimentation. These are all related to Fat Man, the implosion type bomb. He was the head of X1, implosion research, X6, assembly and assembly tests. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And Z1, experimental systems. Now, a couple things to point out here. You can see the badge photos there, and there's Parsons. He's on your right over there. The head of X Division was George Kistiakowski. You can see him. My favorite story with George is, well, first of all, his background. George was a White Russian. That is, the White Russians fought the Red Russians in the Civil War. He fought against the Bolsheviks, was able to escape with his life, completed his education, worked in Washington for a while, came out here. One of the interesting things he did, now we're all familiar with the ski hill. I think this seems like a pretty Los Alamos crowd. We're familiar with the area. That's not the original ski hill. The original ski hill was called Sawyer's Hill, and he was the one who was responsible for clearing it. How do you make ski runs when there are all those pesky trees in the way? You strap Composition B to them and blow them up. And so that's how the first ski hill was created by George there. We've met Deke, of course. We know about Robert Oppenheimer. I do want to point out one last thing on this slide. Z1, Z Division. Have you heard of Z Division before? Z Division started out, they were basically tasked with weaponizing the bombs. So we came up with the bomb design, but the bomb design, we're talking about the physics package, what goes on inside the bomb. How you put that in a deliverable, accurate case is another part of the project. And Z Division was set up to do that. They did most of their work down at Kirtland Air Force Base, and they grew into another organization separate from the laboratory that still exists today. And if you were here for which lecture was it that Rebecca was here? The third lecture, we think you know what that organization is today. It is Sandia. So great, we had some lecture attendees who came back today. But anyway, he worked in Z Division as a group leader as well. Now, I give a couple of talks on World War II. If you're going to be participating in Family Day, I'll be giving a 2-part lecture on the World War II years as part of that over at UNMLA, and I'd like to invite you to come join us for that if you're able. I'm going to skip over a lot of the World War II stuff because, again, we want to focus on Norris and his years as director. But before we leave World War II, let's talk about Trinity and the end of the war. Now, Norris Bradbury was responsible for assembling the Trinity device's non-nuclear components. I'm sorry. You can see it didn't have opponents. You've all seen this iconic photograph at the top of the Trinity Tower. They set the Trinity device off on top of a 100-foot steel tower in hopes that it would eliminate fallout. They hoped that the fireball might not come in contact with the Earth, and as such, scoop less of it in the atmosphere. Hey, it was an interesting idea. Needless to say, they built the towers much taller in Nevada in the subsequent years after this. But you've probably all seen this photograph, but that's Norris up at the top. He was responsible for, among other things, getting that bomb from the ground up to the top of it. And this picture as well, you've probably seen this. This is actually a still from some film that's taken out. This is Norris Bradbury performing surgery on the Trinity device right there. And of course, this is the image from the test. He wrote a 5-page procedure for getting the bomb ready to go. And we have that in the laboratory archives. And I wanted to share with you the last directions included in that. You can see Saturday, July 14th, 1700 hours. The gadget is complete. The other 4.5 pages lead up to this point. Sunday, July 15th, all day. Look for rabbit's feet and 4-leafed clovers. Should we have the chaplains down there? And then you see the next day, Monday, July 16th at 0400, bang. So Norris Bradbury he had a very important job getting the bomb ready, getting it hoisted. That was all part of his Z Division duties at the time. The test, of course, was successfully conducted on July 16th, 1945. Does anybody know what the date is today? Right. So today is the 68th anniversary, I believe, of the Trinity test. So I guess it's been about 68 years and 6 or 7 hours since this test was conducted. It achieved a yield of 21 kilotons. That's 21,000 tons of TNT. If you've looked at the Trinity test and you've heard different reminiscences from witnesses who were there, I'm guessing that probably Robert Oppenheimer stands out. Many years later, Oppenheimer was asked on a television program, what was it like? And he says, I remembered the lines from the Bhagavad Gita, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It's all this ethereal kind of stuff. And that's what you would think, right? I mean, from the Trinity test, the first nuclear explosion, I don't think that was representative of what most people felt like at the time, though. I think Bradbury's quote is much more representative. He says, for me to say I had any deep emotional thoughts about Trinity, I didn't. I was just damn pleased that it went off. So I think that's how most people felt. I mean, think about it. If you had been working on this 6 days a week, from sun up till sundown, and again, the goal, now the Germans had been defeated at this point, but for many of those years, they were scared that they could wake up and find out that London had been attacked with a Nazi nuclear weapon. They were working quickly under immense pressure to get this done. As they were getting closer to the test, how well would you sleep knowing that thing's sitting up on top of this tower waiting to go off? Everybody was exhausted. And when it went off, I think that there were two dominant emotions that were felt by people. First of all, here, relief. It worked. Thank goodness. Maybe the war, and again, the war had been going on since 1939 for the United States. We had been at war basically since 1942, the tail end of 1941. War weariness was setting in, and that's something that you don't hear very much about. Noel Pugach touched on that in his lecture last week, but there was a lot of war weariness. People across the country were tired. People were tired of hearing that their sons were being killed in combat. The other emotion that was felt was fatigue. So they were relieved and they were exhausted. That's how most people felt after the Trinity test, including Norris, who gives us this very candid and I think representative quote. We'll talk about the end of World War II for just a moment. Of course, we're probably all familiar with this information. Hiroshima was bombed August 6, 1945. In that attack, which used the little boy weapon, so again, the implosion bomb, the Fat Man bomb, was used. It was tested at Trinity. That was not the first bomb that was used. The first one used was the little boy, the gun-assembled weapon. 80,000 people were killed immediately in that attack. It was a 16 kiloton blast, a little bit smaller than the Fat Man type bomb, the implosion type bomb. But one thing is, and I don't have it, when I give the World War II presentation, I have pictures of damage, people who had been injured, things like that. We don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I do want to impress upon you the cataclysmic nature of this attack. That 80,000 number that you see there, those are people who were, like it said there, killed immediately. Here one moment, gone the next. About that many more people were injured in these attacks. Some of them died hours later. Some of them died weeks, months, years later, years early because of their injuries. But you had a relatively healthy and intact city that was completely destroyed almost instantly. On August the 8th, in the final hours of August the 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. This was a big setback for the Japanese as well, because the Soviet Union, the Japanese thought, were trying to help them negotiate an acceptable peace. Now, the Japanese were a long way from the unconditional surrender which had been demanded at Potsdam. They had been wanting peace for a long time, but it was peace on their terms. It was peace that would have allowed them to continue to dominate Korea, much of mainland China, keep the islands that they still were holding on to, and to retain the emperor, no questions asked by the Allies. When the Soviet Union turned their back on the Japanese, they lost their best bargaining partner. And again, I don't think I said it specifically, but the Soviet Union, though an ally, had remained neutral with the Japanese up till this point. The other thing that happened was they had redeployed the Red Army from Europe all the way out to the Manchurian border. It was 3 months to the day since the Germans had finally surrendered, May 8th to August 8th. They invaded Manchuria. That campaign cost the lives of 84,000 Japanese soldiers. So that's another, this was another significant event that brought the Japanese to the bargaining table. And well, let me take the word bargaining out. That brought the Japanese to surrender unconditionally, and the surrender was unconditional. Another part of that process was the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th. In that attack, the Fat Man implosion-type bomb was used. 45,000 people were killed immediately by that 21,000 kiloton blast. The reason fewer people were killed, even though the blast was larger, is because they missed the target. Fat Man tumbled way off target, exploded right over the Mitsubishi arms manufacturing plant, completely took out the city's war-making capability, but fewer civilians were killed. But nonetheless, 45,000 people killed instantly with a similar number injured. And of course, we mentioned August 14th and why that's an important date earlier. On that day, Japan surrendered unconditionally 68 years ago. Now, here's where we get into what I think is really the meat of this Norris Bradbury lecture. Then what? You know, we see all the documentaries on World War II. We've read the books. We've seen the biographies of Robert Oppenheimer. We've talked about the controversy of the ending of the war. But then what? What happened after that around here? Well, just as a lot of people don't give it much thought today, that they didn't give it an awful lot of thought back then either. After the war, approximately half the staff left. Now, why would half the staff leave? Well, here's your first crisis. The average age for a staff member during World War II was 26, 27, 28 years old. A lot of people who were here had not completed their degrees. They had to go back to school. A lot of other people, including Norris Bradbury, well, they had good jobs. They were professors. They wanted to go back. And so we went from a staff of about 2,500 at the end of the war to about 1,200 in May 1946. So the laboratory's hemorrhaging people at this time. Oppenheimer left immediately. He formally resigned as director in fall of 1945, but he was gone. Oppenheimer didn't want to be the director of Los Alamos forever. He didn't think this place was going to be around forever. And he had a good job. He wanted to go back to just being a professor. But Oppenheimer, he was the most famous scientist in the world. He went from being essentially unknown to most people. Of course, he was very well known within the physics community, but to most people, they had never heard of Robert Oppenheimer. Went from that to being on the cover of magazines. Just like that at the end of the war. Now, so things never worked out for Robert Oppenheimer. In part 2, we're going to discuss the Oppenheimer hearing. If you don't know what that is, you'll find out if you come back. And do please come back and bring a couple friends, as I asked before, to the next talk. It's a tragic chapter in American history, but one we're going to spend some time talking about. Now, Groves and Oppenheimer, General Groves, of course, was the head of the entire Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was not just Los Alamos. Los Alamos was a small but disproportionately important piece of the Manhattan Project. But Oppenheimer was the director of one laboratory. There were many other facilities as well. General Groves and Oppenheimer wanted Bradbury to take the helm. Now, you can see why in this quote that General Groves offers in his memoir. Let's read together down here. After much thought and considerable discussion with Oppenheimer and others, I asked Dr. Norris Bradbury to take the position. Bradbury had spent several years at Los Alamos and had played an important part in the development of the gun-type bomb. That should be implosion-type bomb. Also, he was a Navy Reserve officer, a circumstance I thought would help him in maintaining smooth relations between the civilian scientific staff and the military administrative officers. Well, you know, he's very well qualified for the job, and he's got two really good recommendations for it. End of story, right? Wrong. There's more to it, and those are what the next two bullets talk about. Groves and Oppenheimer liked Bradbury, but they didn't even bother calling the University of California. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, wait, why would they call the university? The University of California, from day one of this laboratory, was the subcontractor which ran it on behalf of the federal government. We work for DOE now, but back then they worked for the Department of War, which is today the Department of Defense. The DOD hired a subcontractor, just like DOE hires subcontractors today. That subcontractor was the University of California. Why? Why would you bring in the University of California to a bomb project? Well, if you are a scientist and Robert Oppenheimer calls you up and says, hey, I'd like you to come out here and work at I can't say where you'll be working. But anyway, I want you to leave MIT. I want you to join the Army, go through basic training, leave your family behind, and come work for me. I'm going to be a lieutenant colonel. You can call me Lieutenant Colonel Oppie. What do you say? How many people you think said, oh, that sounds great? Click, you know. It was a recruiting tool. That was one of the main reasons. He could tell scientists, you know, he couldn't recruit anybody out here. So they went to the university and said, hey, we can't tell you what you guys are going to be doing, but we want to put your brand on everything that we're doing for an important war project. What do you say? And if the university said, yes, we're at war, it's in the national interest, of course we'll help. Just tell us what we need to know, or need to know, and we will not ask questions about the rest. So it was a recruiting tool. Everybody who Oppenheimer called, he could say, hey, you'll be joining the faculty of the University of California. What do you think of that? That was reason number one. Reason number two was, you know, all these supplies, all of these things that would have to be purchased for the project, all of the correspondence, et cetera, it looks a lot less suspicious if it's marked University of California than it does Department of War. And so it gave them a cover for the secret military nature of the project as well. The university was still running the laboratory after the war. They didn't want to be much longer. They were looking forward to getting out of the business. But nonetheless, they were in charge. And when they found out that a new director at their institution had been appointed without anybody even making the call back to Oakland, they weren't happy about it. And one guy who I think expressed his displeasure was Robert M. Underhill. We're going to see Bob Underhill in different parts of the lectures coming up because he is an important part of our history as well. His title was Secretary-Treasurer for the UC Board of Regents. In short, his job description, keep the regents out of trouble. That's his job. He's the bulldog of the regents. And so when he found out about this, he wrote a letter, and in part it said this: the decision as to whether or not and when the university leaves the project would not at all be based on Dr. Bradbury's opinion, for he had never really been our employee and had no administrative touch with the university and the controlling board. In fact, his methods of administration in many respects are not along lines approved or developed by the university. Ouch. So, you know, that's really not what you want your boss writing about you. And so remember that whole likability thing about Norris? That's about to come in pretty handy. So things are not looking good. He's lost he's in the process of losing half his staff. The University of California, which cuts his paycheck, does not like him. And he didn't want to stay here. He didn't want the job. And so he kind of shrugged and said, okay, look, I'll do it for 6 months. So Norris Bradbury is the interim director of an institution that has no future, has half its staff, and where the main contractor wants to leave. Wow, who wants that job? You know, well, let's see how things started to turn around. We've kind of hit the nadir of the laboratory's history at this point in a Bradbury's career. Those first months after he took over were not easy. He spent a lot of his time struggling with domestic emergencies. You know, all of a sudden, you know, all these crummy stoves that the government brought in that would never start, they became Norris Bradbury's problem. The pipes froze that first winter after the war. There was no water coming up to town. That was Norris Bradbury's problem. He had to figure out and coordinate trucks to bring water up here every day. All kinds of problems like that he had to deal with. But at the same time, he created a future for the laboratory. And I've shared these are in his words, his plan for the laboratory. I tie the first and the third together because as you see, they're going to be very similar. Norris says, we will set up the most nearly ideal project we can. You know, why does he say it like that? The most nearly ideal? Because he knows resources are leaving, not coming in. That ties into the third one as well. We will decrease the project in size so that it can be accommodated on the Mesa on a civilian basis. In short, half the staff's gone. What do you do? Those two are tied together. In short, you do the best you can with what you got. And with every day that passed, they had less. The second point, though, to me as a historian, is the most interesting. Now keep in mind, Norris Bradbury is an interim laboratory director at this point. And the laboratory, nobody's guaranteed that it's even going to be around. Norris says, we will not discontinue weapon research until it is clearly indicated that this can be done. Wow, that's a really significant decision for a laboratory, or for a laboratory director, much less an interim laboratory director to make. So the United States has a monopoly on nuclear weapons at this point in time. Nobody knows what to do. A lot of people may see it as saber rattling if you decide to continue working on weapons. I mean, this is a decision that you would expect to be debated publicly, and it was, not necessarily weapons design, but if we would continue. Should we develop the thermonuclear bomb? Should we get rid of nuclear bombs? You know, in the days after World War II, a lot of people wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. And the plan that was taken by the United States to the United Nations, known as the Baruch Plan, was basically this. The United States is going to reveal all of our atomic secrets to everybody. But in exchange, everybody has to agree not to develop their own. We're not going to have weapons. We're putting all the secrets out there, but nobody is going to have weapons. Well, of course, that didn't work out. The Soviets rejected it immediately. You know, if there's a weapon that can be built, Stalin is going to have one. And that's how it was back then. And so that didn't go anywhere. So this decision by Norris is huge, hugely important. Now, here's the thing. You could come up with a great plan for the laboratory. Maybe you're in charge of an organization or a club or something like that. You could come up with all the great plans and schemes in the world, right? Planning's not really that hard. Execution is what's difficult. And it's really difficult to execute any plan if you don't have any money or people, right? And see, that's the thing. Now, it was important for Bradbury to have a vision, as we're going to see as we get into the next slides. And I think that is, the importance of this is testified to by Richard Baker up there. Baker was an associate laboratory director. He said if Norris hadn't stayed, I think the lab would have collapsed. That's how important he thought Norris Bradbury was. Now, Norris, on the other hand, though, you know, if you don't have people, if you don't have money, if you don't have a customer, you're not going to stay in business very long. Fortunately for the laboratory, a customer arrived on our doorstep right after World War II. So which branch of the service did Leslie Groves work for? Which branch of the military service was in charge of the Manhattan Project? The Army. The Army Corps of Engineers was in charge. So the Army has nuclear weapons. What do you think the Navy wants? Hey, we're with the Navy, Los Alamos. We were wondering. The Navy comes along and says, well, look, we want some of these things too. Can you build some for us? Because we want to find out what these weapons will do against naval targets. We've got a bunch of old U.S. ships, a bunch of old German ships, Japanese ships, all this surplus stuff. We thought we would put these out in a lagoon in the Pacific, nuke them a couple of times, and see what happens. Are you in? That was Operation Crossroads. That was our first post-war test series. And they dropped a Fat Man type of implosion bomb in the first post-war test. It was Crossroads Able. And guess what it did? Just like Fat Man. It tumbled off target. We don't have many pictures of that test. There are some from Able, but it went off almost directly over the unmanned photographic ship. So they did not miss the next time. The next shot that they did, they had a conning tower from a submarine. You know the top part of a submarine where the periscope is and all that kind of thing? They took that, they put the bomb inside of a conning tower, put it under the fleet. They got him the second time in that test. But Operation Crossroads and the Navy were very, very important to our existence and remain so today. The Navy is essentially, one of our primary customers even today. And keep in mind, our second laboratory director, Naval Reserve Officer Deke Parsons, one of the two associate directors of the laboratory during the war. The other was Enrico Fermi, the famous Nobel laureate. So the Navy and the laboratory have deeply rooted and important connections. Now, because we had a customer show up, I think that prompted Bradbury to say, maybe not in direct response to Baker, but to say what held the place together was the Navy's program to determine the effects of nuclear bombs against naval vessels. That's why I call Bradbury the fortunate visionary. You're not going to be very fortunate if you don't have a plan. And if you don't have a plan, you're probably not going to go very far either. So he came up with a plan for the laboratory. As you'll see in the next slide, he was able to sell it. The Navy came to our rescue and gave us work to do in the months following the war. We're down to our last couple of slides for today. This is kind of cool. I don't have to go through the whole thing. I like this. I'm going to start breaking these up more often. Why is he the savior of Los Alamos? And these next two are a couple of my favorite slides. Remember the likability. We talked about Norris being likable. That's where this starts to pay off. Bradbury successfully collaborated with Groves. Now, Groves was not necessarily the nicest guy in the world. Those of you who are familiar with the history know that. He could be very abrasive. He could be very gruff. But the two of them got along together extremely well. True to his plan, which we saw in the previous slide, he began building his ideal laboratory with the resources that he had available. He started building. He went from writing all this stuff down to actually producing a tangible product very quickly. Now, everybody knew that the Army was on its way out right after the war. The Army was not going to have exclusive ownership of the nuclear arsenal. Everyone knew a civilian organization would take over that responsibility, but that civilian organization did not exist in those intervening years. It wasn't created until 1947. January 1st, 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission first comes into existence, the predecessor of today's Department of Energy. Do let me assure you, they didn't just change names. There's a big difference, but essentially that the lineage can be traced back. I'm giving a talk tomorrow for badge holders at the library over at the laboratory, and we'll be discussing the years 1970 to 1992. It's a good story. There is an obscene gesture included in the talk, so I hope that you'll be able to come over and check that out. Of course, when you're talking about Washington bureaucracies, that's inevitable at some point, right? But you do come back for that. But Bradbury convinced the Atomic Energy Commission to adopt his plans for Los Alamos. They were the new guys, right? Bradbury already had a plan. So when they're created and come in and they're trying to get their act together and get their footing, Bradbury says, well, look, I already know I know what the laboratory can do for you. And he sold that to them. He sold that to the Atomic Energy Commission and its commissioners. Now, this is an interesting, let me see what I've got on my next slide. Yeah, I'm going to save that. going to leave this general for now. Gradually, Bradbury also won the confidence of the UC Board of Regents. Remember, these guys don't like him. He's the guy who was hired without them being consulted. You know, gradually he won their confidence. So things are looking better for the lab. Things are looking better for his relationship with his employer. Now, here at the laboratory during that time, we were doing some very, very important work. We were refining fission weapons, just as Bradbury said. We're going to make them more user-friendly, lighter, more powerful, more versatile, safer. And also, we were working on the hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear bomb. There was a group in World War II, led by Edward Teller, he who should have remained without his name being uttered, right? But there was work on the hydrogen bomb going on during the war, and it continued. It never stopped during the intervening years. That's going to be important when we talk about the Oppenheimer hearing next month. Now, Glenn Seaborg, who himself was a Nobel laureate, and he later became the AEC chairman, he had this quote, which I think is interesting. In early 1947, at least a substantial minority of the AEC's General Advisory Committee believed that neither Los Alamos nor Norris Bradbury would long be on the atomic energy scene. Now, hopefully at this point, you're still asking, you're asking, well, wait a minute, this guy agreed to serve for 6 months. So aren't they right? Isn't Seaborg right? You know, I mean, he's an interim director. Well, let's see how that changed on our last slide today. I think it's our last. I had a little fun with the font in PowerPoint, as you can see there. But anyway, as we said, the lab's future started solidifying in the later 1940s. The AEC rapidly expanded Bradbury's budget. $100 million, and I guess it's the running joke, that used to be a lot of money, was secured to rebuild the technical area in the later 1940s. Where was the original technical area of the laboratory, the main technical area? Where was it? Downtown. No, I mean, right around here. Ashley Pond was really the epicenter of the wartime lab, of the lab in the early days. That's where the director sat. That was it. It's not there anymore. Actually, the pond's not even there anymore right now, right? But they rebuilt the technical area. One of the first big projects that they undertook was the TA-41 tunnel. The tunnel, maybe you don't know, but there's a tunnel that goes under the McDonald's dining room. Down at the bottom of the canyon, there's a tunnel that goes directly into the side of the mesa there, and there is a vault within this secure tunnel at the end, right under the McDonald's dining room. That's where the U.S. nuclear stockpile was stored in the later 1940s. Remember, the AEC is in charge of nuclear weapons now. Well, they can't handle bombs and all this, but they can hold on to the fissionable material which goes into the middle of them, and that's where it was stored for a couple of years back then. TA-41 was built in the late 1940s. Omega Bridge, Omega Canyon Bridge, what's the other name for it? I like the traditional historical name. That was built in 1950, around those. And of course, they built the bridge so that they could rebuild the main technical area at what is today TA-3. The old administration building was opened up in 1955 and built in the early years of the 50s. The CMR building was built and it was opened in 1952, I believe. So big construction projects. The laboratory is physically being rebuilt by Norris Bradbury at this time. There was also a $7 million housing project. I know there are a lot of houses with for sale signs on them here in Los Alamos these days, but up until about 10, maybe 15 years ago, it was really hard to get a house here. There were not that many available. And so it was always a challenge, but they were able to start expanding the community with the $7 million. Now, back to why is Norris still here? He was going to leave after 6 months, right? Well, he made what was called the tree shaking statement in around 1947, 1948 at that time. And the tree shaking statement was basically this: if you came here during the war, the government promised to pay your moving expenses in full. None of this 40% tax business that they do today. That was my first unpleasant surprise at the laboratory. I haven't had too many since. But they would pay your moving expenses in full to wherever you wanted when you decided to leave. So a lot of the staff members who stuck around, they were like, well, you know, I kind of like it here. Maybe I'll stick around. But then again, the government will pay me to leave wherever I want, so maybe I'll be looking for jobs elsewhere and this and that. There was a lack of commitment from a lot of the staff members because they had that get out of jail free card, get out of Los Alamos free card, right? Bradbury said with the tree shaking statement, you know what? The government promised to pay your moving expenses, and they're going to. But that is now a limited time offer. You have X amount of weeks to make a choice. Now, wait a minute, he's our interim director. Well, look at his quote here with me. When I made my 6-month statement upon becoming director, I didn't think I wanted to be the director. I thought I wanted to get out. But I decided I couldn't run a laboratory that would have a future unless I was willing to put my own future on it. It needed a man that believed in it himself before others could believe in it. Norris decided to make a commitment. He decided to provide that leadership and to provide an example for others. Look at the last bullet. Remember the likability business? So now, you know, Groves liked him, but Groves is gone. The AEC, they love him. They love this guy. Bradbury also, not only did he repair the relationship with our friend Bob Underhill, remember, who wrote the letter a while ago? Not only did he repair that professional relationship, but they became friends. They became genuine friends as well. So again, all this success, so much of it goes back just to Norris's attitude. And oh yeah, I forgot, that's our final slide, isn't it? And wow, I mean like right on time too. So in part 2, and I want to give you a sneak peek at the first slide, we're going to talk about the context, the greater context of Norris Bradbury's world. Bad things started happening again in the later 1940s. The Cold War was a fascinating conflict. And we're going to expand our perspective out beyond Los Alamos when you come back next month. So do come back. Find out how we fought the Cold War, the early Cold War here at Los Alamos, what Norris did, and how the laboratory changed. And here's the thing. So now we know why the laboratory is a permanent institution. But you don't know why it's a multidisciplinary institution yet. Back then, they just worked on weapons, almost, not entirely, but almost exclusively. We do all kinds of science here today. Why? When did that start? What was the context for that? We're going to talk about that and a lot of other things next month. So again, thank you very much for being here this afternoon. I very much appreciate your attendance, and I can't wait to see you again in August.
Thank you. So we have time for just a few questions, but we'll be happy to take them. Anybody have a question for Alan?
When the project first started, where did they procure the uranium from? Was it from Africa or domestically harvested?
The uranium, and you know, I haven't thought about that in a long time. The uranium came from various sources. I think that a lot of it was actually collected in Canada, and as well as African sources, which they were able to procure and put under lock and key as well. The procurement of uranium was something they were very, very nervous about as the project started. Again, who is our primary adversary? Who's going to beat us to the bomb? The Germans, the Nazis. One of the things, and this is alluded to in Einstein's letter, which is a copy of which is on display just right out here. In 1938, the Germans annexed Czechoslovakia. That was a big deal for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons why was that the mountains of Czechoslovakia were loaded with uranium ore. It essentially gave Hitler the last piece of the puzzle to build a nuclear weapon. Very concerned, very, very concerned about that. Of course, as the war went on, it wasn't so much the supply of uranium as, wow, how do we separate one isotope from the other on industrial scale? And so I think that they had more than enough raw uranium ore. But you know, producing enriched uranium was really arguably the most significant technical challenge of the entire project, I think. You know, it's one thing to separate an isotope in a laboratory. That's hard enough in 1943, but how do you separate enough that is enriched to the grade that you would need for an atomic bomb. And so that's where I think our primary two sources came from Canada and in Africa as well.
Another question.
And double check me on that, fact check me on that, because again, I haven't thought about it in a while.
That sounds right. Another question? Anyone?
How did
Please
Bradbury-
use this, sir.
How did Bradbury get interested in physics in the first place? Do you know?
Boy, let me think back. I haven't thought about that in a while, and I do think that there is an account of that. One thing, going back, I mentioned the Historical Society earlier. Unfortunately, we don't have our bookstore next door anymore, which was really a loss. Everybody's leaving, Linda. What's going on? No subway?
Hopefully they're coming back soon. Someone's coming back.
Well, one of the publications by the Historical Society, and there still is a bookstore in town. The Los Alamos Historical Society has a bookshop next door to Fuller Lodge in the museum there. There should be a monograph that was, it was put together by a woman named Jenny Ebinger. Many of you may have known Jenny. She was here around town for many, many years. She compiled a lot of first-hand sources and put together this book called Norris Bradbury, which is available. And I would not be surprised at all if it's recounted in there. I don't remember the story of how he personally got interested. Bradbury, and I think that this is shown by his father's experience as well, he was just trained to be curious, to be interested in everything, and he was really good at everything that he tried to do. Again, I think that was a trait passed down from his father. So, a lot of times in cases like this, it's a family friend, maybe they stumbled across a textbook at a library, maybe a professor or a teacher that they had in high school, something like that. That's what I see pretty commonly in looking back at how these scientists, especially the first generation ones, got involved. I don't remember Norris's specific story, though, and I do apologize for that. I'll see what I can do for part two. I do get to come back, right?
You do.
Okay.
I have a quick question for
Yes,
you, Alan.
Linda.
So after, apparently in 1945, after the war ended, there was still funding available to continue running this project site-wide. But in 1946, they continued with an appropriation, and was it still under the Army Corps of Engineers?
Yes. In 1946, it was still part of the Department of War. It was still under the Army Corps of Engineers, and it was still their budget. Now, I go budget because the original project had an unlimited budget. They weren't, the government didn't say, look, you can spend $500 million and that's it. During the war, it was, Groves was very cost conscious. He tracked every dollar that he could. He was scared that if he didn't use taxpayer dollars responsibly, that he would be audited, court-martialed, and if he was lucky, spend the rest of his career at some radar station in the Aleutian Islands. Go figure, responsibility with taxpayer money, So it's but that was the mindset. But to answer your question, I don't know the exact dollars and appropriations, but this was just kept going under the Army Corps of Engineers until its successor organization officially took over January 1st, 1947, in the AEC. So, good enough?